Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's the 11th of August, 2025. Some 5 years ago, actually 5 years and a month ago, I did an interesting show with a young American journalist or a young Nigerian journalist who lives in America called Osita Nwanevu. He had written a response to, at that time, it was a big story. It's been forgotten now. A letter in Harper's Magazine on political correctness. It was part of the great debate over wokeness and what liberalism should and does mean in America. He wrote an interesting piece back then for the New Republic called The Willful Blindness of Reactionary Liberalism. Over the last 5 years, Osita Wanvu has been very busy, and he's produced a very intriguing new book. It's out tomorrow. It's called The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. And Osita is joining us from his home in Baltimore, Maryland. Osita, nice to see you after 5 years. Would it be fair to describe this book as a conclusion of your thinking of America over the last 5 years in these two periods of Trumpism?
Well, thank you again for having me. And I think it would be fair to say in a certain respect. So I started the book in 2021. I'd been kind of rooting around for an idea for a book for some time. But by then it became kind of clear to me that in the 10 years or so since I've been covering politics, starting around in 2016, democracy has kind of been at the center of things. Obviously, Trump wins the election in 2016 by electoral college victory rather than a popular vote victory. This incensed a lot of people, especially me. I mean, I remember the 2000 election and feeling very angry as a second grader that George Bush had won over Al Gore, even though more people voted for Gore. So Trump winning that way was the second time in 25 years. And since then, we've given more reasons by Donald Trump to think deeply about democracy. Obviously, the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, the attack on January 6th, everything that's going on certainly now within the last several months. But also, as I covered the Democratic primary in 2020, I also thought that there are things about that political moment that called democracy to mind. I found myself having to write over and over and over again. Well, if even if the Democrats win, they're probably not going to pass Medicare for all. They're probably not going to pass a Green New Deal. They're probably not going to pass immigration reform or gun control because there are structural impediments in the system that make it very, very hard for them to do any of these things without basic reforms. And as I wrote that, multiple times across different articles, I felt like I needed an opportunity to sort of delve into whether that was just and whether that was fair and why the system was set up in that particular way in the first place. And also a way to respond to conservatives who said, when I pointed these things out, well, we're a republic and not a democracy. And that's actually the way we ought to be. What were the arguments that I could marshal against that rendering of what America is and should be? So all of these different things kind of coalesced into a book that I wanted to use as an opportunity to delve into what democracy means in the first place, delve into whether we have a democracy in America, and to think through, if we don't have a democracy that is to our liking, what can we do to actually improve our situation more fundamentally? And that's where the book comes from.
Yeah, it's interesting. The book's already getting a lot of attention. You were honored by a big piece in the Atlantic by George Packer, an old friend of mine. He's been on the show several times. His headline was "How Not to Fix American Democracy," and his take on your analysis is that you're in the same camp as the radical conservatives or the reactionary conservatives who suggest that America never was a democracy and perhaps never will be. What do you make of Packer's critique?
Well, on this point, I think the conservatives have always treated this as a kind of weird is-ought situation. Yes, America is a constitutional republic, and that's what we ought to be, because that's what the founders wanted. I don't think that's how things work. I think a status quo being a particular way doesn't mean that is the right and just thing for a situation to be. I think that Saudi Arabia is a theocratic monarchy. That doesn't mean Saudi Arabia should be a theocratic monarchy. In the same way, I think that it's fair to say, and conservatives are right to say this, that the founders intended the creation of a constitutional republic, did not really want a majoritarian democracy. But that's no reason why we shouldn't want one, and we shouldn't work to make America one someday, and that's what the book argues for. And I know this is like a little bit controversial, especially amongst progressives. I think that people tend to resist the conservative argument by arguing that the founders really deep in their heart of hearts wanted us to be a democracy, and a republic in their sense of things, their understanding of things, was just a representative democracy. I don't think the historical record actually supports that. I think that Republican governments at the time that the founders drafted the Constitution had been mostly not democratic. The Roman Republic had certain popular features, but was not a representative democracy in the way that we understand representative democracy today. The Italian maritime republics during the Middle Ages and Renaissance were Republican governments, but they were governments that were ruled by merchant oligarchies. They weren't democracies. And so the founders themselves did not really believe that a republic was an intrinsically democratic system. What they believed a republic was a system where you had distributed power in a certain sense. You had rules to govern politics, certain rights. But all of that did not have to mean that you were instantiating mass rule. And in fact, the founders took great pains to create a system in which we would not have mass rule. And I'd argue that that system is what we still have today to a large extent. So I agree with conservatives more than you might expect leftists would on the nature of the system. We do have a republic that is not a democratic republic, but I think we should become a democratic republic with some of the reforms I talk about in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. George Packer, of course, card-carrying liberal. Also, Yascha Mounk, he's been on the show lots of times. You did a very interesting debate 5 years ago with Yascha on liberalism and identity politics. In your view, then, I don't want to personalize this, but is the liberal camp who seem most offended by Trump and Trumpism, are they democratic in your way of defining the word, or are they ultimately not that different from the kind of elitism that the founders, the maybe not even so much the Jeffersons, but certainly the Hamiltons and the Madisons intended, an elitist, quote unquote, democracy?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question. I was really dismayed after November's election and Donald Trump this time around actually winning the popular vote, to hear people who are liberals and people even on the left, people who'd spent so much time in the last decade arguing for more voting rights and ending gerrymandering, these kinds of things on pro-democracy grounds, say because Donald Trump won the popular vote this time, well, actually, maybe democracy isn't as cracked up, all it's cracked up to be. Maybe we've been giving too much attention to or had too much faith in the concept of democracy. Maybe the American people really are too stupid or too addled by misinformation to govern themselves rightly. I heard this all the time in social media in those early months after the election happened. And it seemed to me that it was an indication that the commitments to democracy we'd heard so much about from Democrats were only about an inch deep. We have to, if we really care about democracy as a matter of first order principle, we have to have more than just a fair weather commitment to it. Embracing democracy means embracing, in some respect, the possibility, in fact, probability that you're going to lose, and lose a lot, depending on the given circumstances of any particular political contest. I'm not for democracy because I believe that if we did all of these reforms tomorrow, we'd live in a world where all the American people would agree with my leftist politics, either in economics or social policy. I believe in democracy for more fundamental reasons than that. And I have this hope that if we're creative enough on the left, and if we do the work of organizing, we can build majorities to support our politics. But I'm not for democracy because I think I'm going to get everything I want, or because I think the American people aren't capable of making mistakes, or that they're always going to be just and fair. I think that there's a background set of reasons why democracy is important in spite of those things. So I guess that's a long way of answering your question. But I think the overall point is I do think that the ways that we've talked about democracy have been shallow. I think that they're shallow at a level that did not succeed for the American voter in this past election. I think people understood themselves as having to choose between this abstract set of ideals that their civics teacher might have told them was important in sixth grade or something, and their groceries and their rents and the cost of living, and they chose Trump for economic reasons. But they perceived, I think, the shallowness of our commitment to democracy in certain ways. And if we're not offering a more robust conception of democracy and what it means, why it's important, I think we're going to be poorly positioned to defend it.
So what I'm hearing, perhaps, Osita, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is in an odd way, and I hear this on the left, real left, leftists like you, rather than liberals like Packer or Yasha Monk, a kind of grudging admiration for Trump's populism. You wrote an interesting piece back in 2022 in the New York Times. Trump isn't the only one to blame for the Capitol riot. You're not justifying it, but you didn't have the kind of liberal response. You've also argued, actually in April of this year, in a mixed way, that Trump has transformed the American story. What's your take on Trump then? Is he quite the evil manipulator that liberals like George Packer argue he is?
Well, I certainly think Donald Trump is as evil as I think George Packer does. I mean, I have no love for his politics in substance or as a matter of style, but I think that he is a force to be grappled with and reckoned with seriously. I don't think you defeat him, if you have an interest in defeating him, as I think we all do, by a return to politics as usual, and then without a captivating political vision. It obviously was not enough in this past election to say Donald Trump is going to come in and destroy our political institutions. In fact, people, I think, voted for Donald Trump because they wanted him to unsettle and disrupt our political institutions. And that mood has to be taken seriously. It has to be spoken to. And I don't think a politics of purely defending, quote unquote, our democracy is going to deliver us the good. I think that we need to instead offer an affirmative vision, a vision that takes people's, I think, justified anger and justified skepticism about Washington seriously, and tells them things are bad. We need to move to a fundamentally different kind of politics, reform our institutions, in the interest of creating a kind of American society that we all should want for X, Y, and Z reasons. That's the kind of vision I'm trying to sketch out in this book and some of my writing moving forward from this book. But I think my overall point in trying to construct that is, I think we've very clearly seen Democrats pursuing the politics of restoration, civility, defensive norms fail over and over and over again over the last decade. And there has to be something different. The party is at a very low place in American public opinion now. So as deeply as people dislike Trump, they seem to dislike the Democratic Party more. There has to be a change in approach. It's not just enough to point to the things about Donald Trump that are bad and hope people come over to your side. You need to offer something affirmative. You need to have to offer a bold, galvanizing vision. And that's what I think democracy could be, if it's not just, again, the defense of institutions, but the desire to actually construct new institutions and think about politics and our economy in a fundamentally new way.
Yeah, and we'll get to those details in a second. I'm curious, Osita, what you made of the Kamala Harris candidacy, the failed one. I get into trouble sometimes because I find her so irritating in the sense that she was so deeply conservative, so very much believing that the system works and that all the American people needed to do was vote for her and she would put everything back into place. There was no need for any kind of fundamental reform. That there's a certain kind of glibness to her and her wing or her group within the party, which of course explained why her candidacy failed and why many people, both on the left and the right, didn't take her very seriously. Is one of the weird things in American politics that it's, if not the left, certainly the progressive liberals who have become the conservatives and who are the only ones who really believe in the system, a kind of meritocratic Ivy League kind of system that, of course, somebody like Kamala Harris represents.
Yeah, I think that's one of the perverse things about this moment in politics. Democrats are seen, because they talk this way all the time, as the people who are there to defend institutions, defend the status quo, defend norms. Meanwhile, as I outline in the book, structurally, the institutions actually disfavor Democrats in all kinds of ways that they should take seriously, because they're not going to be viable nationally if they don't eventually. On the other hand, Donald Trump is, I think, understood by most American voters as somebody who stands against the institutions, against the structures in Washington, and so on. But he and the Republican Party not only benefit from the institutional structures of our federal system a lot, but as a matter of policy, their agenda is lowering taxes predominantly for rich people, deregulating for the benefit of corporations, and so on. So there's this topsy-turviness to who's seen as defending institutions, who's not. And Democrats, for reasons that I truly, maybe it takes somebody who's a psychiatrist to understand. I have no idea why this is the case. They're committed to the defense of institutions that are substantively hurting them and making it difficult for them to both win elections and pass the policies, substantive economic and other social policies that they'd like to see happen. And so I think Kamala Harris's campaign, the second half of it, I think, reflected this tendency pretty directly. I think that even in the brief time that she was a candidate, you saw this shift from an early campaign where there was a lot of energy and a willingness to talk about Republicans in a different kind of way, and they're talking about freedom as a value, and there are interesting things going on. That shifted towards the end of the campaign towards something that sounded like Joe Biden, talking once again about Donald Trump and authoritarianism, defending the institutions, and so on. Bringing Liz Cheney on the campaign trail, rather than, and there's been a lot of postmortems about what the campaign was thinking in these final weeks, rather than offering a robust economic message that might have done more to address voters' concerns. So yeah, I think you can fairly assess whatever you think about Kamala Harris as a person, as a political figure. The campaign that they ran at the close was a campaign that Joe Biden could have run if he were more able physically, and a campaign that I think was doomed to fail. It was not a distinctive departure from the administration that I think you would have needed to have happen in order for people to feel compelled by the Democratic ticket.
You're suggesting you need to be a psychologist to make sense of why Democrats would be conservative about a system that doesn't benefit them. But of course, the commanding heights of the party is controlled by the coastal elites. You're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C. So in some ways, it is in the interest of these coastal elites to maintain the system, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it depends on what their aspirations are. I mean, the coastal city of Washington, D.C., my understanding today, is going to be occupied by 1,000 National Guard troops.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. That's the headline today. Ordering the National Guard to Washington and taking over the Capitol's police. Although I'm not sure that would necessarily have much impact on powerful political figures in DC. But that's
it might not. But I think we've seen in the last several months, especially, an agenda that I think has been bad for even wealthy people who would like to invest in this country and invest stably. What's going on with tariffs? Who is actually benefiting from that? Is it the workers? Is it CEOs? I think that's a loser for basically everybody. You've seen this attack on Harvard University. You've seen these attacks on liberal civil society. So there are ways in which this loss is actually, I think, hurting even the commanding heights of the Democratic Party in ways that you expect, purely in their self-interest, them to wake up and appreciate. If their political failures led them to the federal government trying to impose its will on the sanctified halls of Harvard University, then something has to change. So yeah, I think that there is, to the best that I can understand, a lot of competing impulses and drives within the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C. You have simple complacency and laziness, people knowing how to do politics a certain way, not wanting to change. You have gerontocracy, people who are a gazillion years old, holding on for dear life to these seats that they can barely sit up within. You have people who are animated by whatever their donors tell them to support. You have people who are quite sincere in their defense of the institutions, and they believe that someday the Constitution is going to work to our benefit if we stick with it long enough. There are all kinds of things, I think, happening, and none of them are actually conducive to building the kind of politics they think the Democratic Party needs. And that's one of the reasons why I think the only hope is a kind of swing leftwards. I think the left has the agenda, the vision, the kind of galvanizing populist rhetoric potentially to revitalize the party. We're seeing some of that in the Mamdani campaign in New York City. I don't know what else the center of the party has left. Third Way has yet to put out its sleep-inducing slate of policy items for the 2028 presidential primary, things that they hope people will pick up. I've not seen a whole lot of newer thinking beyond the idea that we should, rework zoning, and maybe I think we should.
Well, there's also
approach. I don't know.
I mean, what's your take on the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance debate?
I think that these are basically dry empirical questions. How to increase private sector housing in places like New York and San Francisco. Important policy conversation, one in which I think that there are new approaches we need. I think we probably do need to deregulate certain things and look at certain processes for improving housing and transmission lines and all these things. This is not the level at which ordinary people connect with politics. This is, I think, matter for urban planners and technocrats to kind of work on behind the scenes logic. It's not the root, I think, of a really compelling mass politics. And I think people perceive that. I think Ezra Klein himself would concede that it's not a complete answer to filling this vacuum in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think he's actually more surprised than anyone with the popularity of the book. If we were having this conversation, Osita, in 1931, we might be suggesting similar things. The system doesn't work. We need a revolution. But then we got a political genius like FDR who cobbled together a remarkable political coalition of people who loathe one another, but somehow he kept that coalition together and pulled off whatever it was, 12, 14 years of the New Deal and all sorts of other reforms, which I assume you're an admirer of. Why can't the system work? Why can't another FDR, maybe Obama-esque kind of character, maybe you mentioned Madami, come along and figure out ways to get unusual bedfellows in bed together and rebuild a new coalition for the 2020s and 2030s? Why do we need a new American founding? Why can't politics as normal work as it has in the past?
Well, I think part of the case the book makes is that there are certain structural inequities within the system that are making politics in that fashion difficult to perpetuate. In a country where, a citizen resident of Wyoming has about 60 times the voting power of somebody in California, that deranges policymaking, that disincentivizes broad coalition forming. If you can accrue a large amount of power in Washington, as Republicans have, by merely dominating a lot of rural states and smaller states and conservative states, and you don't have to make appeals to people in New York City or in Baltimore. That actually constrains coalitional politics and narrows the extent to which you can make appeals to a broad section of the country, which is what FDR had to do. Democrats, are increasingly concentrated within urban environments that don't count for much, and it's a system that is almost designed to make it difficult to forge the kind of coalitions that FDR did. And there were forged, I should say, too, after a moment of extraordinary crisis with the Great Depression. I think that creates political opportunities, those kinds of situations, potentially, if there's somebody creative enough with enough of a vision to make use of that moment. But I think we have a system that's bad for politics. We have a system that forces us into a duopoly, rather than allowing new voices into Washington, new parties, new coalitions, formations of people to form. And if we want to change things, I think we have to look at the structural reasons why politics have remained as static as and as state as they have. One example I should point out to here is this gerrymandering debate that we're having this last week.
Which
where,
is, of course, part of the debate over Texas.
Exactly. This matters a lot. So we have this tit for tat where every 10 years after the census, both parties will do their part to basically draw the other party out of as much power as they can manage, but with the redistricting process. If we had, as I argued in the book, a system of proportional representation, where you're not just electing one person per district, but you're actually you're electing multiple people per district, and you have Democrats, Republicans getting a share of votes in each district, but also potentially third party and fourth party candidates. That would completely transform American politics. That one kind of change to the way the House is designed. In the absence of that, if you have districts where the person with the one individual person who gets more votes than everybody else wins, you're locked into a political system in which only two parties are basically represented. That's something that ought to shift, ought to change. In the 20s, in the 30s, you actually had this brief moment where you had different third-party movements, whether the Socialist Party or the Bull-Moose Party, these other formations.
About the 1920s and 30s.
That's correct. That's correct. You had more of a third-party politics then. I think one of the reasons why the FDR adopted the programs of the New Deal that he pursued was because the Democratic Party is facing this challenge from the left proper that he had to respond to by building a large coalition. But now we have this more entrenched duopoly that I think keeps politics within certain bounds. And it's partially for structural reasons I think are worth exploring and worth reworking if we can.
You talk about these structural reasons, and we'll get into some more of the details of the kinds of reforms you want. You want reform to the way people vote and the electoral mapping of America. But there was an interesting piece in today's Times by Ben Rhodes. He's been on the show a few times about how short-term thinking is destroying America. It's not just an anti-Trump or anti-Republican argument. It's the broad cultural argument about Americans not being able to think beyond any kind of short-termism. It affects both left and right. Mm-hmm. How are you going, Osita? How, in your view, your book is not it's the opposite of short-termism. It's a long-term vision for 21st century America. How are you going to alter the cultural canvas so that Americans begin to think in the long rather than the short term? Does it require a massive crisis? Does it require them to put away their smartphones? What is required here?
I certainly hope it doesn't require a massive crisis. But as I kind of said, those can be moments of opportunity. I wish that were not so. I mean, we could more reliably institute large-scale changes in the absence of those kinds of threats. But I don't know. One thing I will say, though, is that points of crisis don't necessarily themselves induce a whole lot of change. I remember reading during the pandemic in 2020 how we were going to totally transform our approach to public health in this country, totally transform our public health infrastructure. And, to be fair to those people, we were right. We made it worse. I think people were hoping that we'd have a more robust public health response to COVID induced by crisis. It didn't actually end up happening. I think what matters even more than having opportunities created in that fashion is having a vision lying around for people to pick up and answer the question of where we go next. And I think that's what the book tries to be.
But you're not answering my question. I mean, and maybe it's because it can't be answered. I'm not suggesting that you should be able to answer it.
No.
Keynes famously said, in the long term, we're all dead. But as Ben Rhodes suggests in his piece in the Times today, we're going to be dead if we continue to think in such short-termist thinking, particularly when it comes, of course, not just to politics or culture or economics, but particularly the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment. I think that, again, it has to be exciting to think long-term rather than short-term. The long-term vision has to be more appealing to you if it's going to work, and if you're going to get people to think on that scale, than whatever's appearing in their TikTok feed or in their algorithms or whatever short-term modes of engaging in politics that they're used to. You have to offer something that feels galvanizing and exciting as a long-term horizon. I think that thinking about American democracy not as something that was perfected in 1787, that is our job to dust off every so often, but as an ongoing constructing process of creating a new society, that, to me at least, sounds like a kind of politics and a kind of vision and a kind of long-term project that could be exciting for people to think about and see themselves as part of, especially at a moment where, as we know, so many people distrust our existing institutions. If your vision of democracy is just about, defending the integrity of the Constitution, defending the norms of the Senate and these kinds of things, you're going to lose out to more exciting forms of short-term, whatever, politics. If you can, on the other hand, get people roped into a long-term view or vision for American society, you then have, I think, a potentially compelling competitor to the politics of now and the immediacy of the moment that we're in. That's my hope and that's my bet, but I'm not sure. I think he raises an important and increasingly, disquieting question. Are we too addled by the easy and the quick hits that were delivered in the ways we consume politics now to think of the scale that I'm proposing? I'm not sure, but I certainly hope so.
Well, let's get briefly, we don't have too much time left, Osita. You've been very generous with your time. Let's get into some details. What exactly are you arguing for? Give me some concrete examples of, I take your point, and I don't think anyone or many people, either on the left or the right, would disagree with you, but that there is a case, maybe not the case, for a new American founding. So we've agreed on that. But what needs to happen? What would you like to see change?
Well, I think that there's some very, very basic things about our system that demand immediate action on basic democratic grounds. I get into what democracy means at a pretty technical level. I don't think you necessarily even need to have that understanding to look at a situation, for instance, like the District of Columbia, about 700,000 people who don't have a full and equal voice in government. You don't have to know that much about democratic theory to be appalled by that situation. There are about 4 million Americans for whom this is true. Most of them live in Puerto Rico without full, direct, equal say in the federal government that governs them. We could offer DC and the territories statehood by referendum. That would democratize the system pretty quickly and directly in an important way, and in a way that I think would...
This isn't very radical. I mean, this has been an argument that people have been making for years.
Yet we haven't done it. That's the thing. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't done it is because we talk about democracy, again, as is the system being respected? Is the existing order of things being upheld? And not saying, well, there are actually features of the system that are deeply, deeply wrong in a fundamental way that we should be animated towards changing. But so there are a lot of political reforms of that nature in the book. But the part of the book that I found most interesting to write about, and the part that I think is going to be most provocative to people, is making the argument that if we're committed to democracy because it is means by which we exercise some control over the conditions of our lives, democracy isn't just a system then that should apply exclusively to politics. We should be bringing democracy into the economy. We should take seriously the fact that somebody who works at Amazon, let's say, has the ability, and I think they should, to cast a vote on what our foreign policy should be with respect to Russia or China. But has nowhere in their life where they can say, this is how I think Amazon should be run, even though decisions at the top of Amazon might affect them more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C. That's a basic democratic issue. It's one that people have thought about for years. John Dewey talks about this. John Stuart Mill talks about this. The Roosevelts, people in American political life used to talk about this question of how much agency do people have at work, and do they have democratic entitlements and rights respected at work in the economy. That's not something we've talked about in a long time, though. And I offer economic proposals that I think will empower workers democratically with the end of both improving their material situation, but also, I think, addressing inequality in ways that will actually redound to the benefit of our political system as well.
Do you think that America and democracy can survive in its current capitalist form. You talk about Amazon. I mean, some people might argue, Osita, that most people who work for Amazon have some ownership in the company, may often be extremely small, but they can impact it in that way. Why doesn't that work? And are you, is one of your agendas in the right of the people to replace American capitalism with some other kind of economic system?
Well, I'd like a more democratic economic system. That's the way that I'd put it. I think that the left twists itself into knots in trying to describe its ambitions to people when it could very simply say, if you work within an institution, you contribute to its value, you should have some say in how that institution functions, especially if it directs and orders your life. I think there's a basic intuition that people have about what they're entitled to democratically that we can use to talk about the economic priorities that we have on the left. And I think inequality and the state of the economy as it stands now is a threat to even political democracy, as I said. I mean, we just saw the spectacle earlier this year of the wealthiest man in the world, because he donated $260 million to Donald Trump's campaign, get awarded a position in government where he did as he pleased. He fired thousands of federal workers, reworked certain programs, ended certain programs. Democracy, in any definition, any conception of it, cannot persist for long, I think, as long as that level of wealth, unchecked, untroubled, exists within the society. I think the ancients understood and took more seriously than we do the fundamental destabilizing nature of large concentrations of wealth. We're on our way to having our first trillionaires in this country. That's a democratic question. That's a democratic issue. Whatever you believe as a leftist, whether or not you've read Marx or what have you, the sheer amount of power that somebody can hold within the society purely as a virtue of the amount that they own, that is a threat to ordinary people governing themselves.
So is this your, I won't say long-winded, but your roundabout way, Osita, of suggesting that democracy and capitalism aren't really compatible?
It depends on what people mean by capitalism, depends what they mean by socialism.
By what you mean by the two words.
Well, I think it's contestable what these words mean, and I instead appeal to democracy. I think that's a word most people think they understand. I'd argue they could understand it more deeply in this particular way. And it's a word that I think communicates our values directly and simply to people. You might not consider yourself a leftist, you might consider yourself more middle of the road, okay, that's fine. But there's a problem if you're committed to democracy with vast amounts of wealth inequality, with workers not having power at work, and there are democratic solutions to those challenges that I think people should take an interest in. I don't think it's worth being sectarian about or doctrinaire about. I think there are people who consider themselves capitalists who can find parts of this agenda appealing. I think there are people who call themselves socialists who might find parts of this agenda appealing. But the uniting principle, I think, is democracy.
Finally, then, you wrote an interesting piece in July, last month, about in The Guardian. You have a column there too. You say, you may not know it, but the Democratic primaries for 2028 are already underway. I think you're right on that front. Is there a candidate? Because ultimately, for better or worse, this is going to boil down to some new kind of personality or other. That has to come first. Maybe the reform will come later. But are there people now within the Democratic Party who you think get your argument, who recognize the right of the people, that there is a need for a new American founding? You talked about the current mayoral candidate in New York City. There's AOC, of course. Are there people who get it on the left politically?
Not that I've seen and heard, unfortunately, quite yet. Maybe the book brings people in my direction. Tremendously inspired by Zoran Mamdani for very stupid reasons, anti-democratic reasons I talk about in the book. He cannot be president of this country. So we have to look elsewhere. And, I really think that the left has this burden now of changing its political approach. I mean, we did the Bernie thing multiple times with some success. I tremendously respect and like Bernie Sanders and the agenda he put forward. But he wasn't successful in building the coalition that he needed to build in either the primaries that he ran on. That means there has to be a kind of shift in the way that we talk about our politics and talk about our priorities. People have to understand, or believe rather, that we're not only coming to them with good policies and good ideas, but we can actually govern, that we can go out into a general election and win. We could speak in a language that touches more Americans. And I think that the left hasn't really built an approach that's capable of doing this quite yet. And so I don't see a figure around that comes.
Is there a
close to mind.
historical figure? I mean, is there a need for a Trump on the left, someone who's out of reality television, a Mark Cuban style, an Oprah Winfrey style television personality who can really replicate what Trump has done from the left?
Well, I'd hate to believe that we can only get our transformative political figures from reality television. I think we'd be in a bad way if that were true.
Well, we
So I
are
hope
in a
that's not
bad
the
way.
case. We are. I guess we are in a bad way. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of hope that, I do think that knowing something about policymaking matters. And so I do hope that the Democratic politicians get a clue here, that understand that their approach hasn't worked, that they need new ideas, new visions, don't even have to be mine necessarily, but there needs to be a kind of going back to the drawing board of sorts, both in terms of the substance of the policies they're arguing for, but in terms of their political style. Democrats are very boring. They're very, very staid. Again, they're read as the defenders of institutions. And that has to go in order to appeal to today's electorate and appeal more specifically to the kind of people who found Donald Trump so attractive and who happen to be very, very important to winning presidential elections. So I wish I knew who it was going to be and who the right person we need is, but I hope that we're in a moment now where people have been shocked into an understanding that politics as usual cannot continue.
Well, when you hear, I'm sure we will hear too. You're a contributing editor, The New Republic. You're a columnist at The Guardian. You've got your own newsletter. You've got your own book. So you're very much on top of this. For boring Democratic pollsters and policymakers, they definitely need to read this new book by Osita Nwanevu, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. It's out tomorrow. I think it's going to be one of the most talked about books of the fall. As I said, George Packer's already writing about it in The Atlantic. So Osita, congratulations on the new book. And I certainly hope it won't be another 5 years till you reappear on Keen on America. So much more to talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me. Anytime.